The year was 1492. Winter still clung to the palace roofs. Frost rimmed the stone walls, and even the servants walked faster to escape the cold. Behind the hall of painted clouds, hidden from the noise of politics and silk rustling through the royal courts, stood the palace clinic. It was a place of bitter herbs, boiling pots, and quiet suffering. That was where she worked. Her name was Yao Zhen. She was 27 years old. Not a girl, not yet old, not a maid, not a concubine. She was a palace apothecary trained by need and sharpened by years of silence. Her hands were rough from years of work. Her robe was plain and often stained. She owned nothing of silk. She had never worn gold. But her eyes were steady and her mind was sharp. Few spoke to her. Fewer still remembered her name. In a palace where beauty was a currency and birth opened doors, Zhen had neither. But she stayed. Day after day, year after year. She stayed because healing was the only thing that made sense. To her, there had been someone once, a man who worked beside her, a junior physician named Wen Liang. He had been kind, careful, gentle with his words. They had shared years together in the same room, mixing herbs, binding wounds, learning the quiet language of two people who almost said what they felt. She thought he saw her. She thought he might stay. But he didn't. One winter morning, she was called to the Pavilion of Pearls. A concubine had fainted, and her presence was requested. When she arrived, the girl was lying pale on a golden couch, barely more than 16, and beside her, holding her hand, sat Wen Liang. He didn't flinch when he saw Zhen. He simply nodded, as if nothing had changed. But something had, deeply, completely. Zhen handed the maid a jar of cream, bowed, and left before her eyes could betray her. That night she burned her hand on a boiling pot. She said nothing. She wrapped it herself and continued her work. When he came the next day, he stood in the doorway of the clinic and told her the truth. He was marrying the concubine. It had already been approved by the Empress. He told her gently, as if she should be proud. He said she would be fine, that she was strong, that she had her work. Then he walked away. He didn't look back. Zhen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stayed. She worked. She said nothing. 3 days later, a young eunuch entered the clinic. He carried a jade token and spoke with authority. "The emperor summons you," he said. Zhen didn't understand. She had never been near the throne, never spoken to anyone of such rank. But she washed her hands, straightened her robe, and followed. The guards at the gate of the quiet hall opened the doors in silence. Inside, everything was still. There were no carpets of gold, no dancers, no painted walls, only a long room, a paper screen, and the man behind it. He was younger than she, expected, not yet 40, dressed simply in black robes, standing beside a table filled with sealed jars. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. He only looked at her and asked one question. "Can you speak to me without fear?" And she said yes. Not because she was fearless, but because fear had already passed through her. And what remained now was something colder, something steadier. She examined the jars, smelled their contents, tasted the bitter oils, and told him the truth. 5 were safe, 3 were weak, 4 were laced with bloodroot, a slow poison, not deadly, but meant to weaken the mind. She said it clearly, without emotion. The emperor listened, then dismissed her with a nod. But before she reached the door, he said one more thing. "Return tomorrow." She returned the next morning. The air was cold again, and the frost had crept back onto the stones, as if winter refused to leave quietly. But she walked without hesitation. The guards recognized her now. They opened the doors without a word. Inside the quiet hall, the emperor waited once again beside the same table, the same jars, the same silence. This time there was a second table, with fresh herbs laid out. He asked her what each one was. She answered plainly. No hesitation, no false praise. He asked why one root was cut lengthwise and not across. She explained that it drew out pain more gently that way. He listened carefully, nodding now and then but saying little. This became their rhythm. Day after day she returned. He watched her work. She explained things he had never bothered to ask before. How scent could change the strength of a salve. How some poisons wore the face of medicine. How silence was sometimes a better healer than words. He asked her strange questions. What made a person loyal? Why do some wounds never close? She answered without poetry, only truth. Because pain leaves echoes. Because some people don't want to be healed. Because fear once planted grows even in sunlight. The emperor never smiled, but he looked at her longer now. He spoke more freely. He asked her to stay longer each time. Still, he never touched her. He never asked about her life, but he noticed when her bandage was fresh. He noticed when her voice sounded tired. He noticed when her hands shook from too little rest. And one evening when she rose to leave, he said quietly, "You're not like the others." She said nothing, but that night she did not sleep easily, because something had changed. Not loudly, not in words, but in the space between their silences. In the palace, the whispers began. The apothecary was being summoned daily. She was not a concubine, not even a maid of noble rank, but still, she was seen walking through the emperor's halls. Still, she was invited past the guards no one else dared cross. Some called her bold, some called her a witch, some called her lucky. Zhen ignored them all. She kept her robe simple. She tied her hair with the same wooden pin. She mixed medicine with the same steady hands. But something inside her had begun to shift. Not with pride, not with hope, but with quiet knowing. She had been seen. Not for beauty, not for charm, but for truth. And that was something no one could take from her. Weeks passed. The emperor asked more questions about poisons, about trust, about betrayal. One afternoon, he asked her if she had ever lost something she never thought she'd survive without. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. He asked if it still hurt. "No," she answered. Only when she tried to remember why it mattered. He said nothing after that. But when she left the room, he followed her with his eyes for longer than usual. Then, one morning, everything changed. The emperor stood waiting as always. But this, to me his words came without pause. "I am being pressured to choose a new consort." She listened. He continued. "They expect a daughter of a noble house, a marriage of advantage." He looked at her. "But I have no interest in that." She stood still. Then he said something no one else had ever dared to say to her. "I want to marry you." The room fell silent. Even the wind outside the shutters stopped. Zhen didn't answer right away. She didn't bow, she didn't smile, she only breathed. And in that breath, everything she had buried rose. The years of being unseen, the moment she was left behind, the feeling of being useful but never wanted. And now this, not a proposal wrapped in flowers, not a promise of forever, but a choice, simple, direct, real. She bowed her head only slightly, then spoke. "If you want honesty, Your Majesty, then yes." The wedding was not a grand one. There were no fireworks, no procession through the painted halls, no music to announce her name. There was only a scroll, a seal, and a silent agreement between two people who had seen too much to care about ceremony. The emperor married her, privately, as if love needed no witnesses. Zhen wore a clean robe, still gray but new. Her hair was combed and tied with a fresh ribbon. No gold, no makeup, just herself. The Empress Dowager did not attend. The ministers did not speak, but the palace felt the shift. Because now, the woman who once carried pots of boiling herbs through back corridors walked beside the most powerful man in the land. And she didn't lower her head anymore. They gave her a residence near the West Gardens. It was small, quiet, with faded walls and a single plum tree growing by the steps. She liked it that way. She refused maids. She kept the clinic open. She still mixed her own medicines, bound her own scrolls, and washed the ink from her hands. At the end of every day, nothing changed, and yet everything had. Because now when Zhen passed through the court, the whispers were different. Some called her a fool, some called her dangerous, but most called her what they never had before: wife of the dragon throne. The emperor didn't visit her every night. Sometimes, days passed without a word. But when he came, he brought no guards, no gifts, only himself. They sat by the window, drank bitter tea, and spoke quietly, or not at all. He asked her what she thought of dreams, of death, of duty. She asked him what it felt like to hold power but still feel alone. They didn't. Call it love, they didn't need to. What they had was built from silence and steady hands, and it held, but not everyone accepted it. One evening, a message arrived, folded in red silk. Zhen opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence: "You may wear his name, but you will never wear his blood." It was unsigned, but she knew who sent it. Lady Lin, daughter of a noble house and the emperor's favored concubine before Zhen ever entered his halls. Beautiful, jealous, dangerous, Zhen burned the note without a word, then returned to her mortar and crushed herbs until the moon rose high. She knew what came next. She had lived long enough in silence to hear the sound of knives being sharpened, and now those knives were being turned toward her. 1 week later, the jars in her clinic were overturned. Medicine spoiled, drawers broken. A single word painted on the door in dried ink: unfit. The guards apologized, servants offered help. Zhen refused both. She swept the floor herself, boiled new roots, washed the stone with vinegar and salt until the word was gone. Then she lit incense and went back to work, as if no one had dared insult her, as if the fear had no place in her heart. Because it didn't, not anymore. She did not tell the emperor. But he knew. He always did. He came to her that night. She opened the door and saw it in his face and the quiet rage. He stepped inside, stood near the fire, and said only one thing: "I will not let them touch you." Zhen looked at him calmly. "Then don't speak. Act." He did. The following morning, 3 high-ranking concubines were transferred to distant pavilions. Their names were removed from the attendance scroll. One of them was Lady Lin. No one spoke of it directly, but the servants whispered. They said the emperor's patience had ended. They said the apothecary had finally shown her teeth. Zhen said nothing. She remained in the clinic, her hands stained with ink and root, her back straight, her eyes still. But inside she felt the shift. Not pride, not revenge, something deeper, a settling, as if the palace itself had accepted her presence, even if it hated her for it. Spring returned to the capital, and with it came the Lantern Festival. It was tradition for the emperor and his empress to walk side by side through the central court, lighting lanterns for peace and long life. But Zhen had not been called an empress, not yet. She had no crown, no title beyond wife. The ministers argued. The Empress Dowager stayed silent, so the emperor gave the order himself. Zhen would walk with him. On the night of the festival, the palace glowed like fire. Red and gold silk streamed from every balcony. Musicians played soft flutes from behind carved screens. The smell of incense and sweet rice filled the air. At the center of the ceremony stood the emperor, and beside him, in a robe of plain ivory, with only a plum blossom hairpin in her hair, stood Yao Zhen. She did not smile. She did not wave. She only lit her lantern, raised it with steady hands, and released it into the sky. It rose slowly, joining the others. A soft light in a sea of hundreds, but every eye followed hers. Even the Empress Dowager's, even Wen Liang's. He stood in the shadows, his face thinner, his shoulders stooped. Beside him, his young wife clung to his arm. He didn't look at her. He looked at Zhen, the woman he had called strong then left behind. And as her lantern floated upward, he lowered his gaze, because he knew he had chosen silk over stone and lost. That night, the Emperor brought her to the Hall of Mirrors. It was the oldest wing in the palace, abandoned, untouched. There, under the flickering oil lamps, he placed a single crown in her hands. Simple, silver, and shaped like a plum flower. He didn't say the words. He didn't need to. Zhen placed it on her own head and walked out into the night, not as a servant, not as a wife hidden in the shadows, but as the woman who had survived every whisper, every insult, every doubt. The woman who now stood without apology, the woman they would call Empress. After the Lantern Festival, her name was added to the records, not as a consort, not as a concubine, but as Empress Yao. The decision shook the palace. Some bowed in silence, some cursed behind closed doors, and some simply watched, waiting for her to fail. But she didn't. She rose each morning before the sun, as she always had. She kept the clinic open. She reviewed petitions quietly. She never demanded respect, but slowly she received it. Not through force, through presence. There were no royal feasts in her name, no jeweled crowns or golden chambers. She did not host banquets or wear embroidered robes. She walked the palace, the same way she had before, with steady steps and eyes that saw everything, and in that stillness she became something unshakable. Then came the plague. It started in the servant quarters, a fever, a rash, a cough that turned red. Doctors panicked. Ministers argued, concubines fled to their chambers, but Zhen did not run. She stayed at the clinic. She boiled bitter herbs. She burned dried wormwood to clear the air. She mixed powders by hand, day and night, until her arms shook from exhaustion. She refused to leave the sick. Even when 2 guards collapsed at her feet. Even when the kitchen girl she had once treated for burns died holding her wrist. She stayed. And the Emperor watched it all. He begged her to rest. She refused. "I was a healer before I was a wife," she said. And he understood, because he had married her for that very reason. The fever broke after 12 days. 17 died. Dozens lived because of her. And when it ended, the Empress Dowager called her to the upper court. Zhen stood in the center of the hall, robes stained with ash, face pale from lack of sleep. The Dowager did not smile, but she bowed her head, just slightly. That was enough. The court followed. From that day on, no one questioned her place. But Zhen never changed. She never asked for more than she needed. She still tied her hair with the same pin. She still wore robes made of simple cloth. And she still boiled her own medicine. The Emperor gave her space and she gave him peace. They didn't speak of love, but love lived between them anyway. In quiet looks, in warm tea left on cold nights, in the way his shoulders softened when she walked into the room. And somewhere along the way, without ceremony or fanfare, Zhen became the most powerful woman in the palace, not because of beauty, not because of title, but because she never asked to be more than what she was, and yet she became more than anyone expected. Years passed, quietly, without war, without scandal. The palace settled into something rare: peace. The Emperor grew older. His hair began to gray. His steps slowed. But his mind stayed sharp, and at his side, Zhen remained. He asked her once if she missed the life before. She said she missed the quiet of not being watched. He nodded, and never asked again. Their days became simple. She rose with the sun. He read reports in silence. They shared a single pot of tea each morning. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not, but their silence was never empty. It was full of things only they understood. A language of glances, of small gestures, of deep knowing. She never wore the grand crown. She never sat beside him on the throne during court. But she ruled in ways no one could see. In the way decisions were made after she passed through a room. In the way generals hesitated before questioning her tone. In the way the people of the palace looked to her before reacting. And then, one winter morning, the Emperor did not rise. Zhen was the first to know. She had felt it before she even opened the door. She walked to his chamber alone, found him still, peaceful, as if he had simply drifted into silence. She sat beside him, held his hand, and stayed there until the light through the windows turned gold. They buried him with the ancestors. The ministers wept. The Empress Dowager dressed in white. The court wore black, but Zhen wore gray. The same color she had always worn. And when asked why, she said, "Because I was his peace, not his parade." After his death, she did not take power. She did not fight for control. She returned to the clinic, tended herbs, wrote scrolls of knowledge for the next generation. She lived in the Western quarters, alone, but never lonely, because the palace remembered, and so did she. Not the glory, not the throne, but the quiet evenings, the shared tea, the warmth of being seen. They wrote her name in the palace records. Yao Zhen, the Apothecary Empress. She had no children, no lineage, no bloodline to protect. But her name lasted longer than any crown, because she healed not only the body, but the heart of a man. No one truly knew until he met her. And somewhere beyond history and gold records and cold statues, she is remembered still, as the woman who was left behind and walked forward anyway, as the woman who was quiet but never small, as the woman who was nothing until the emperor saw everything in her, the end.
If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Tell us in the comments which moments stayed with you. Like if you believe quiet strength is the most powerful kind. Share with someone who believes in love that grows without noise. And most of all, subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Tales of women who were overlooked, but never forgotten. Your next favorite story is just one click away.